When one holds the most powerful office in the land, and in modern times the world, you are sure to make many enemies. Our next series is actually inspired by Stephen Sondheim's musical Assassins, a musical that dramatizes 9 individuals who either successfully assassinated or attempted to assassinate the holder of that office. All the individuals try to explain what brought them to do what they did, but the reality was the mental instability of all individuals. So our next series will be on the men and women who tried to, or succeeded, in eliminating the holder of the highest office in the United States. Now, I will be covering only notable individuals. Ever since the establishment of the Secret Service, there have been thousands of attempts, but most have been silently stopped. So today we're going to start with the first successful assassin, that of President Abraham Lincoln, on April 14th, 1865. Now, this plan had started years before, but it was not actually an assassination plan originally. Originally, John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor but Confederate sympathizer who was a member of the Confederate spy organization, the Knights of the Golden Circle, planned with his cohort of conspirators to kidnap Lincoln. Now, he talked to the Confederate Secret Service, and he with his conspirators, David Harold, Samuel Arnold, John Surratt, George Atzerodt, Lewis Powell, and Michael O'Laughlin, planned to kidnap the president. The plan was because Lincoln had named Ulysses S. Grant to command all Union forces, and Grant ended the prisoner exchange between the Union and Confederate armies. So the plan was to kidnap Lincoln and ransom him for Confederate prisoners to try to replenish the Southern armies. But on March 17th, conspirators gathered on a back highway that Lincoln would have to take back from the Campbell General Hospital north of the capital. A few hours passed until one of the conspirators arrived to tell them all that the fact that the president was not going to come. He was instead going to do an event at the National Hotel, which ironically is where Booth lived while living in Washington, D.C. Richmond, Virginia would then fall on April 3rd, and Abraham Lincoln would enter the city on the 4th. 5 days later, the Army of Northern Virginia would surrender to General Ulysses S. Grant and General George Gordon Meade and the Army of the Potomac. 2 days later, on April 11th, Lincoln would have his second inauguration. With the fall of Lee's army, Lincoln looked forward to reuniting the country and not perpetrating punishment on the South, but also the total integration of freed men and women into the general population with the rights of all citizens. Unknown to Lincoln, standing a few hundred feet behind him was John Wilkes Booth. Booth was furious at the idea of African Americans' equality with white men. This is when the kidnapping turned into assassination. Booth and his cohorts made a plan, and John Surratt would flee, seeing the plan as too extreme, escaping to Canada, then going to Rome, where he served in the Papal Zouaves, part of the Pope's army. But Booth, being such a prominent actor, had all the insider information about where people were going to be. In fact, Lincoln was a fan of Booth, and had multiple times asked for an audience, so Booth was able to track Lincoln very easily. He discovered that on the 14th, Lincoln with Ulysses S. Grant and both their wives would be going to a theater in the city, and he would plan to kill both men. But this wasn't all. The plan was to completely cripple the U.S. executive branch. So after Booth killed Grant and Lincoln, Lewis Powell was assigned to go to the home of Secretary of State William Seward and assassinate him. Then George Atzerodt would go to Kirkwood Hotel and kill Vice President Johnson. David Harold would help Lewis Powell and then escape to Maryland, where he would meet Booth and disappear into the South. The morning of the 14th came, and Booth was given information. The president would not be at the original theater, but instead be going to Ford's Theater to see Our American Cousin, a comedy. So again, Booth assembled his conspirators and decided they would all strike at the same time, then make their way south. There's always a legend told by Julia Grant that while she and her husband, General Grant, were leaving the city, their carriage was stopped and Booth peered his head in, staring at them. Another famous legend around this day was Lincoln's famous premonition. I kept on until I arrived to the East Room, which I entered. There I met with sickening surprise. Before me was a catafalque on which rested a corpse wrapped in funeral vestments. Around it were stationed soldiers who were acting as guards, and there was a throng of people gazing mournfully upon the corpse, whose face was covered, others weeping pitifully. "Who is dead in the White House?" I demanded of one of the soldiers. "The president," was his answer. "He was killed by an assassin." But as day turned to night, all of the men assumed their positions. Harold and Powell arrived outside the home of Seward. Atzerodt had arrived at the Kirkwood Hotel, and Lincoln was quietly riding to Ford's Theater, where Booth would be soon. The sad irony is people noticed Lincoln was in such a good mood that day. Finally, his life was at peace since the ascension to the presidency. At 10:10 a.m., Powell forced his way into Seward's home. Noticing Seward's son in front of his bedroom, he went to shoot him, but the gun misfired. He then savagely began to beat Frederick Seward with his revolver. Then he would kick the door open to find Seward in bed. Seward had just had surgery and had a metal brace around his head. Powell began to viciously stab at Seward, his knife becoming soaked in blood. He then ran out. The reality was he didn't actually land a single mortal wound, only cutting Seward enough to produce some blood. When the screams from Seward's nurse and daughter began, Harold already escaped to meet Booth. Now, Booth had arrived at Ford's Theater and was hiding behind a servant's door behind the presidential box. He knew the play, and he knew when the funniest joke would cause a large applause and laughter. So with his Derringer revolver, he walked quietly into the box. At 10:15 p.m., as the theater began to jubilantly laugh, Booth placed his revolver to the back of Lincoln's head and fired. Lincoln slumped forward, and Major Henry Rathbone, who had replaced Grant with his fiancée Clara Harris, jumped up. Rathbone attempted to stop Booth, but Booth slashed Rathbone down his left forearm. Rathbone collapsed in pain as Mary Todd looked to her husband and Clara screamed. Booth jumped from the presidential box, the spurs of his boots getting caught on the flags decorating the bottom of the box, resulting in him shattering his ankle when he landed on the stage. He looked to the crowd raising the bloody knife and yelled, "Sic semper tyrannis, the South is avenged," or something very similar for the second half. Then Booth, limping, ran off stage. An officer began to pursue Booth, but failed, and then Booth stabbed the orchestra leader who attempted to stop him. He reached his horse, striking another man who attempted to stop him. He knew he only had moments before the city would be put on lockdown. Now, Atzerodt had chickened out, as a victory party had been going on, and there was many officers and soldiers everywhere all over the Kirkwood. So instead, he ended up just drinking and leaving the hotel. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton would be the first cabinet member contacted. He had been spending the evening at the War Department, as the Civil War in other parts of the country was still raging on. But he quickly made his way to the home across from Ford's Theater, where Lincoln was being treated for his wound. He would assemble the cabinet, with the exception of Seward, who was now recovering from his attack at his home. He then had Lincoln's eldest son, Robert Todd Lincoln, come to see his father. Lincoln would die, and Stanton would either say, now he belongs to the ages, or now he belongs to the angels. Stanton would then order Grant to return to Washington, and he would begin the manhunt for not only the assassins, but anyone believed to be involved. He placed the entire cast of Our American Cousin under arrest. The military authorities would arrest John Surratt's mother, Mary, knowing he had connections to Booth. While investigating the Surratt home, Lewis Powell arrived, being immediately arrested by the investigators. Surratt was arrested at his cousin's home in Germantown, Maryland, after they discovered banknotes of Booth addressed to the home in Maryland. During Booth's escape, he and David Harold stopped at the home of Samuel Mudd, a surgeon in southern Maryland. Now, most evidence points to he having no idea of the assassination and was simply following his Hippocratic oath. But he worked and tried to brace Booth's leg on April 15th. Booth and Harold would then leave again and have a few more stops until they arrived at the Garrett's farm in Virginia on April 24th, 1865. While making his escape, Booth, Harold, and even John Surratt's face was on every wanted poster in the country. A platoon of troopers from the 16th New York Cavalry were sent to pursue Booth and Harold. After discovering the location of the two men, they arrived at the Garrett's farm on the early morning of April 24th, 1865. The officers commanded the men to surrender and exit the barn the two men were hiding in. Harold surrendered, but Booth refused to. So the soldiers lit the barn on fire to smoke Booth out. From a crack in the barn, Sergeant Boston Corbett could see Booth, who was holding a carbine rifle. The soldiers were ordered to take Booth alive, but Corbett insisted Booth was getting ready to shoot him or some of the other soldiers, so he placed his revolver through the crack and shot him. Now, there's some inconsistencies with his story, because Booth was shot directly in his vertebrae, square in his back, which means that Booth wasn't facing Corbett when he fired, or was even in a position to fire, because usually when you're going to shoot, you turn your body so your whole body's aligned with your gun. But being he was shot square in the back, it's easy to say that he was just standing there. But the soldiers would drag Booth out, where he would look at the soldiers and say, "Tell my mother, I died for my country." He then requested they raise his hands to his face, which the bullet had caused him to lose use of his entire body, so he could not lift them. He stared at them, saying, "Useless, useless," and then he died. He would be buried at a family plot in Baltimore in an unmarked grave. However, the other conspirators would be put on trial, not a normal trial, a military tribunal by generals and officers handpicked by Edwin Stanton. On June 30th, all conspirators were found guilty in a clear kangaroo court, and the following were sentenced to death: Lewis Powell, George Atzerodt, David Harold, and Mary Surratt. That the prosecution insisted her son was pivotal in the conspiracy as Booth's right-hand man. General Winfield Scott Hancock was assigned the duty of conducting the executions on July 7th. By clapping his hands twice, Hancock executed the conspirators by hanging. People were horrified by the fact that Mary Surratt, a woman, was hung, especially considering the case against her was flimsy, and many saw it as anti-Catholic feelings that really is why she was executed. So, Congress passed laws protecting U.S. citizens from civilians from military tribunals. John Surratt would be arrested later on, I believe in 1866, and put on a civilian trial, and the court was a hung jury, and Surratt was set free. The Lincoln assassination terrified the nation, that something like this could happen. Someone could successfully kill the president. But it would also terrify people how Edwin Stanton, an unelected bureaucrat, was able to seize the government and take military control of the country, even though he would surrender the reins of power once the executions were complete. Thanks for watching, everybody. This is the first episode in our Assassins series. Tomorrow we'll be discussing possibly one of the most unhinged of these individuals, Charles J. Guiteau, the man who killed James Garfield. Thanks for joining us. This is definitely a new series for our usual. This is definitely a new series for what we usually subjects are, but it's an interesting one. Please like, share, and comment. If you're new, please subscribe and join this growing community. Thanks again, and see you real soon.